Former President Kgalema Motlanthe is slamming the state of municipalities in the country. He says 90% of them are in trouble, with many completely dysfunctional. He was speaking at the Foundation's annual Drankensberg Inclusive Growth Forum. Well, that gathering is entering day 2, so let's find out what we can expect from eNCA's Aviwe Mtila, who has the golden ticket to all those very insightful conversations. Aviwe, it feels like just yesterday that I spoke to you at last year's gathering. Has enough changed in the country for the conversations there to change, or is everything being overshadowed by the looming elections coming up next year?
Similar conversations, Marcel, that are being had, that were had just last year, that will detail the state of South Africa in almost 30 years of democratic South Africa. It's just looking at the myriad issues that the country faces, whether it be the state-owned entities or whether it be just service delivery woes and the services that the people aren't getting. We also had the finance minister here just yesterday speaking on the purse itself, suggesting that we don't have money, but of course he can't give much on what is going to happen, given that he is to present the budget, the midterm budget that is next Wednesday. But just to get insight now, I am joined by someone that used to handle the purse. That's Jonas. Thank you for joining us at eNCA. A lot was said around just our even fiscal situation in the country. How do we turn the tide around, and how bad are our finances? Because it wasn't looking good, according to the finance minister last night.
Okay. Look, I mean, I think we must be clear, though. I mean, what we call fiscal challenge is actually a challenge of growth. Because if you have growth going, then you have the revenue that you require, and therefore your fiscus is healthy. So the truth of the matter is that South Africa has been growing at an average of 1% for a number of years. So that is the fundamental problem. That's the crux of the problem. Fiscal challenges, that we don't have money, etc., is a symptom of that fundamental problem. And you can address that. You cannot address that only by borrowing. You've got to address that by addressing the fundamental point, which is growing the economy, igniting growth in the South African economy. That's the challenge we face. And I believe that, and that was my argument right through the session, is that fundamental to that, to addressing that, is the political question. Do we have the commitment? Do we have the political will to actually do the unusual? And there can be holy cows if you are to grow the economy. So that's the conversation I think that everybody is talking about. The second point, of course, is that you need consensus across society. And that is why I think one of the things that we're kind of punting very hard is that there has to be a national conversation. We do need to convene a national convention just to ensure that South Africans talk together and at least hammer a common vision. We have trade-offs, you know, because I mean you can't have growth without trade-offs. We have trade-offs between different sectors of society. And what are those trade-offs? And what is their impact on growth? And that's the fundamental conversation. We can address fiscal short-term issues in fiscus by borrowing, cutting expenditure, but we must also understand that those are not easy questions if your economy is not growing. You know, so whether you cut, you borrow, how much you borrow, how much you cut, is takes you ultimately to nowhere. I mean, unless you grow the economy and therefore you have the revenue to sustain the programs that government have. That's the challenge.
And the finance minister seemed to suggest that he won't be cutting much going into the budget next week, but of course can't give details. You mentioned that we're growing at 1% almost on average in the last number of years. How do we then change that trajectory, and what has honestly led to that stagnant growth?
A number of factors. I mean, if you're firstly, I must start off by saying, and that's the argument that I was making very strongly, that our growth model is fundamentally flawed. And we have to trust that there. And that's why National Convention become a serious platform, because we start looking at our growth model. And we need to transform our growth model, and in such a way that we start putting more in manufacturing, and we start more diversifying the economy, but also we start linking education and training with everything that happens in the economy. The second part is investment. the economy can grow without investment. The NDP projects that by 2030 we must have reached the target of 30% to GDP of investment, fixed capital investment. We are sitting at 14 at the moment. That's a fundamental constraint. And we're not going to be able to get investment, by the way, if you don't have the right policies, if you don't have the right frameworks for private sector to invest in areas like SOCs, etc. But also the global situation is also tightening, becoming different. The world, I use the word that the globe is becoming dangerous. I mean, you have hard choices to make, and trade is being weaponized because of geopolitical situation. From Ukraine now we're talking about the Palestinian crisis. And by the way, we're going to get into crises globally as we go along. It makes the flows of investment into the developing economies difficult. So we do need to ignite our internal strengths also to actually balance up. But there are opportunities. But we must create the right environment for investment to happen. I'm saying that those are some of the issues that we have to do, but they require leadership.
And
they
an
require
important
political guidance.
I'm going to that exact point. You mentioned how we need these frank conversations, and politics is at the fore of the crisis that we have. We've been under the leadership of the African National Congress for the last 29 years. We're going into the elections next year. Are they the correct vehicle to lead us to these changes that we need?
Look, I mean, I'm not a fan of regime change. I must make that very clear. But I think we need to pull the country together. And that can only happen if we pull all sectors of society, those progressive elements in the ANC and the ANC itself, everybody else, into a conversation about a new vision for South Africa. The 1994 consensus has broken. In fact, it has reached its sell-by date. Because, I mean, it was based on a particular basics, a growing economy, strong public sector, very coherent and representative stakeholder organizations. All of those things don't exist. So you need to go back to the drawing board. Unless you do that, you are not going to move this economy anywhere. You might have tweaks and changes, and elections are important, but elections are not democracy. They are part of democracy. They're important. But ultimately, you need society to come together and talk together and act together in driving growth in this economy, but also deal with issues of inequality, transformation, etc. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Basically, join us there, the chair of MTN, of course, suggesting that we need those tough conversations as a country if we were to move forward. That 1994 consensus is broken, and of course, to take the country forward, we need tough decisions, essentially. That's, of course, at this Inclusive Forum that wraps up tomorrow here in Drankensberg.